My name is Melissa Ziobro, and I'm the Specialist Professor of Public History at Monmouth University in West Long Branch, New Jersey. Today is November 4th, 2021. We are here today with Dr. Kenneth Womack for an interview to augment the project Monmouth County 9/11 and its aftermath. Dr. Womack is a professor at Monmouth University and the author of the book World Trade Center Through Time. This interview is being recorded with the permission of all participants. Ken, can you just confirm that you do indeed consent to the recording and you understand that the interview will live in the public domain?
I confirm and consent.
Thank you. So tell us just briefly about your early life. Where and when were you born and raised?
Sure, I was born in 1966 in Houston, Texas. I grew up in a suburb of the city, Kingwood, Texas. I went to Texas A&M University for my bachelor's and master's degrees, and then moved to Illinois, where I earned my PhD in 1997 at Northern Illinois University in English.
Okay. Let's just fast forward then to the month of September 2001. Where were you living and working at that point?
In 2001, I was in my fourth year as a tenure track professor at Penn State University at the Altoona College. And I was, I guess, in my last year on that route. And on September 11th, I was in my office, and I imagine, like a lot of folks around the country and the world, a colleague knocked on my door and said, a plane has hit the World Trade Center, and they're not sure if it's a small plane or not, but everybody's watching in the break room. So I marched down the hall about 30 yards at the most into this really large room we had in our, I guess, for lack of a better word, the administration building. It's called the Smith Building on that campus. And there was TV set up and everybody was glued to the TV. And the second plane had hit right before I walked in. And of course, people were suddenly realizing that this was no coincidence nor accident.
Were you supposed to teach that day?
I don't think so. I was the honors coordinator, so I had a reduced load, and I don't think my course took place that day, but I'd have to go dig into it. I don't think so.
Yeah. Did classes get canceled at all that week?
Not at the university, I don't believe. Some public schools did.
Did you know anyone who was at either the World Trade Center or in the Pentagon, anyone you were concerned about as the day unfolded?
I didn't know anybody at either of those sites, but I did know my brother, whom I still know, who lived in Brooklyn at the time. And I was unable to call him because all the circuitry had gone haywire. And these were the early days of cell phones and nothing like the technology that we have today. So there was a period where I couldn't get in touch with him, but he would have had no reason to be over there. His wife worked at the Empire State Building. And so, initially we were somewhat concerned about her. It turns out later, what I found out is he, and I don't know what this says about my brother, he was watching Regis and Kathy Lee when he learned about the first plane. And so he went up on his roof and watched everything he lived in Park Slope at the time. Now he's back in Austin, but so I was concerned for him, but I didn't think he had any business that would have brought him downtown.
No, I've been interviewing a lot of people who were in Monmouth County, obviously, that day. And this area was so deeply impacted. It took a very long time for people to feel like we got back to some semblance of normal. But you're out there in Altoona, right? Did you feel like things got back to normal, perhaps a little more quickly than they might have here?
I don't think so. I mean, there would have been and I know this now from living in this county, in our non-COVID county times, you see the city all the time. So there would have been a visual reminder. Obviously, lots of many casualties in this area, and and that speaks for itself. The difference out there, at least on the day of, we were concerned because we'd heard about the plane that was flying our direction, and of course went down in a field not very far from that campus. So people felt a connection in that way. But also there was that interesting resurgence of a kind of, I don't know, nationalism that occurred afterwards. And very quickly, pickup trucks would have two flags placed on either side, typically on the, on the mirror structures. And they're mostly pickup trucks in that area. So very quickly, there was this enormous outpouring of nationalism. And it, in some ways it's good. It's the building of community, but there were some dark sides of it too. Some incidents involving folks from other ethnicities who were sort of threatened by these fellows. And they were typically fellows with their, with their flag displays, not acting like good citizens at all. So there were some issues I had to deal with there on our campus, in fact, involving some of this. So there was an interesting and somewhat lengthy aftermath. And of course, like the rest of the country, we were just in shock for a long time.
Yeah, that's actually something that comes up in almost all of these interviews. And if it doesn't, I ask about these intense patriotism and also anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant backlash in the aftermath of the attacks. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, I can even give you an example. There was a faculty member, and a year later, I was named as the head of Arts and Humanities, a really large unit there at the university. And one of my faculty members, an artist from the Philadelphia area, whom we've been very fortunate to bring into campus, happens to be an African-American, was accosted at one point and sort of cornered by a couple of these trucks on a street corner about, I don't know, a mile from the university. And that was a real, it was kind of a wake-up call about, the disjunctions that existed then and still exist. And this is in the state, right, that proudly ask people to visit Gettysburg, right, and to talk about, the Civil War and being on the right side of history. I just noticed we were on the wrong side of history a lot of times after that in our area. It was kind of sad.
That's important to remember when we discuss the aftermath as well. So let's pivot and talk a little bit about your book. As I said, it's called World Trade Center Through Time, and it was published in 2017. What inspired you to write the book? Well,
it actually was inspired much, much earlier. I was inspired by the publisher because they had read my, I guess it was 2011 novel, The Restaurant at the End of the World, which is the story, very loosely fictionalized story of the staff, management, visitors to the Windows on the World restaurant at the top of the North Tower on September 11th. And I'd become interested in this because as we closed in on, I think it was about the 8th anniversary of the attacks, I started to think about just randomly one day, the restaurant. And of course, it wasn't one restaurant. The World Trade Center had numerous eateries, right? This was just the flashiest one. But, it was a large complex of restaurants, had loading docks in the basement where, the enormous amount of provisions would arrive every day. And I was really struck by this. And I've also been fascinated my whole life by restaurant culture. I've known a number of folks who are chefs who've worked in kitchens and in this kind of professional capacity, and they always have the best stories. They play pranks on each other. Of course, things sometimes get really tense, and which is bad because they have knives and grease, right? And so I just wanted to learn more about the folks who were there. And to me, that was, just something I wanted to do. And I figured it'd be very easy, right? Fire up Google and start looking into it. And what I discovered, there was almost nothing about them. And there was the wonderful series, which I'm sure the Portraits of Greece series from the New York Times, which is on my shelves here somewhere, that I was able to use for some of the stories, but those were typically for the folks who were in management, right? Who were more well-known, more well-heeled. And the chef, Michael LaMonaco, had survived the attack. He was actually in the mall getting new glasses at Lynn's Crafters, doing a kind of mundane everyday thing, while his staff was trapped, up on the 106th and 7th floors in the North Tower. And this was an enormous restaurant that I quickly learned. Each floor was an acre. So this was 2 acres of restaurant. It was so large that they had very, very big and lucrative banquet facilities. Lots of weddings were held there, et cetera. In 2000 and 2001, it was the most profitable restaurant in the United States by far. Enormous success. And really one of the great success stories, particularly early in the life of the Trade Center, when it wasn't so always admired as part of the landscape, right? The restaurant had been such an important feature in gaining acceptance for those monoliths. Anyway, I was interested in the folks there. And so I did what anybody does when you want to start tracking down who's who. I made a spreadsheet, right? I got out Excel and I started to make a spreadsheet, and I was able to get the names of, I think it was 137 employees who were there that day. There were actually only a few visitors because the breakfast service had sort of just begun to end. So there were maybe only five people still, munching on smoked salmon or whatever at that time, unfortunately, and a few people getting ready for a big conference on the lower level that was going to occur. But I wanted to account for them. What was their job? Were they a server? Were they a cook? Were they the sous chef? Were they the pastry chef? Were they the sous pastry chef? The whole thing. And I eventually was able to account for everybody who was there on the floor, and to create this apparatus. And as I learned their stories, and I would often only learn one anecdote or another about them, I created this kind of snapshot, right, of their lives. And nobody dies in this book. Nobody actually does use knives or grease on anybody because, far be it for me to invent some narrative that involves these characters who lost their lives engaging in something as trivial as a fiction work, right? But instead, I was interested in their imaginations. So, an Ecuadorian restaurateur remembering fishing with his dad, right, in the sea, things like that. So I was able to bring in those anecdotes, and I've actually heard from several of the folks whose lost relatives are written about, and they were pleased. They were happy to have their relative remembered in some way, because many of them were undocumented. They were, they really were. What earnings they were making, they were sending them back to whatever nation that was, and suddenly they had a little monument. And I'm really proud of that. And then when the pools were constructed at the site, some of the names were left off, and so I was able to help out. I don't know if I had a material effect on it, but I was able to share my knowledge with the folks there who were making sure that they had all of the names engraved, that nobody was being left out, because what an awful thing that would be, right? So I think I was able to help out with my spreadsheet there, and that makes me feel good about it. But anyway, it was because of that book, which is really a novella. It was because of that book that I talked to the other press, which I think is involved with the history press in some way. And they said, hey, why don't you do a World Trade Center Through Time book? And I said, nobody's done that. They said, no. I said, okay, well, great. And actually it timed out well because I was moving here. And so my first several months when I was here at Monmouth University, every now and then on a weekend, I would jump on the ferry and go to Lower Manhattan and try to understand the geography of the development of Radio Row, which then, of course, transforms into the Trade Center site, which obviously has had several permutations since then.
Hmm. Let me pause you there and just back up to the novella for a moment. Did you speak to the chef or any other staff members who either survived or weren't there that day? Did you speak to anybody personally?
No, I did not. I worked with, I wrote some families of the relatives to get information because there were a couple that were just blank spaces.
Yeah.
And for me, that was, that was a problem. I felt like if I'm going to do this, everybody has to be name checked in it. Right. And so that's actually, as a narrative device, the conference was very useful because you have to have name tags and the like. And so I was able to make some of those sorts of connections. I have spoken, and this goes back a few years, so this is a project that I think needs to be reborn, to some of the folks since this book was published, the novella, about now going in and doing a nonfiction work about the history of the restaurant, because there are larger, interesting stories to tell. I did not talk to Chef LaMonaco. He was very clear about his story, and understandably, he was just heartbroken by what happened that day, and of course, the helplessness of not being there with them, and then I would imagine a certain level of survivor's guilt. At that time, a lot of the survivors were working on a project. I think it has since lapsed, but it's a Lower Manhattan restaurant called Colors, i.e. all the colors of the world coming together. And it was a revivification of the restaurant concept. But I think in some ways they did it too early because, a lot of the money and the resources, et cetera, had not really returned to Lower Manhattan immediately. And so they were really pushing hard to create this monument. I'm not sure where they are now or if they survived COVID. It was there at least a few years ago, but a lot of them were busy doing that. An interesting thing about restaurants of this kind, you're talking about mostly wage workers, right? And, it was sort of like terribly 100 years earlier when the Titanic went down, when the ship went down, the pay stopped. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of the beneficiaries of the breadwinners who were on the ship who weren't salaried were suddenly suffering. And the same was true when the restaurant shut down, the income was gone. So I know that they did lots of work later to help make folks whole. I mean, as much as one can after that, but they were in for some tough times. And for some of them, of course, those tough times never ended.
So I'm hoping everyone is going to go and read both of the books, honestly, for themselves. But can you give us just a thumbnail history of the site?
Sure. So it's pretty fascinating. It's a wonderful public works project. Of course, it was one that was rife with controversy, right? I mean, Radio Row and that whole world that had existed for so long in Lower Manhattan was under assault. I think this was advanced by Rockefeller, right? And of course, lots of money were behind it, the Port Authority, all of these units coming together. And what they did succeed in doing, of course, is revitalizing Lower Manhattan ultimately as a place where people live and work, and there's a work-life kind of existence that wasn't there in quite the same way at all, really, when it was really just this ragtag, massive community of stores. So, I mean, obviously there was lots of controversy. I detail some of this in the book. There were protests and strikes, and I think a lot of people were burned in effigy, a lot of politicians, that sort of thing, as they attempted to construct this, this big idea of a World Trade Center and all of the revitalization efforts that were associated with it. So, the building of it went from a controversy involving civic issues, and it turned pretty quickly into an engineering challenge, right? Because while the visionary who had designed the towers was interested in the aesthetics of these monoliths, right? The engineering challenges, on the other hand, became massive because, of course, of the groundwater issues. They had to build the bathtub, as they call it, the enclosure that is still there, protecting businesses and the like, and the PATH train from being overrun by the harbor. So, there was massive engineering challenges. I detailed the construction, which occurred over a period, I believe, of years. It was 6 years for each tower to go up. It was no easy feat. And this was with the benefit of the special kinds of cranes that they had. And I should have studied, but I believe they were called giraffes or something of this nature.
Kangaroos.
Kangaroos. Thank you.
Kangaroo cranes.
There you go. So you've read it more recently than I have. Yeah, the kangaroo cranes, which would allow them to build up and not have to pause and do all of that sort of business. So there were a number of engineering feats that were created, one of which my grandfather was consulted with on, which was he was a civil engineer in Houston. And that was the sway. One of the famous aspects of the towers was that they had a built-in sway of 3 to something like 9 or even a foot, which sounds crazy, but the only way to deal with the wind shear at that level and to maintain the integrity of the buildings, even at an acre for each floor, and that central elevator structure, was to build in this level of sway. And it was something that people had to become used to who worked there. And the reason why he was consulted, he had done the same thing for the Astrodome, which involved a huge, giant concrete suspended roof. And it's roughly, 13, 16 stories above the ground, still is as of this recording. And it is moving right now with a similar sort of sway. And that's how the building is able to find its integrity. And the World Trade Center was being constructed very similarly to the Astrodome. So he got a trip to New York City and was able to talk to some of the folks who were working on the project. But and I think did something similar for the Chicago, what was used to be known as the Sears Tower, right? And these buildings really are defying a lot of different forces, namely gravity, but also wind shear and storms. In the case of the Astrodome, it was built to withstand hurricanes and 2 sonic booms. I don't know that the World Trade Center was built with such storms in mind. Although, of course, anybody building now with climate change should be thinking about that.
You said it was your grandfather who consulted, correct?
Yeah, Kenneth Zimmerman.
I was going to ask his name. Okay.
Yeah,
was he alive in 2001?
Yes, he died, I think, in 2006. So he was aware.
So in the thumbnail history you just provided, something I think a lot of people forget, I think my students would be surprised, was that the towers are initially seen by many as like an intrusive monstrosity, right? So how do they go from that to this kind of cultural icon, even beloved by many?
Yeah, if we're being brutally honest, which we should be, right, when we're capturing the textures of history, I remember the day it happened. Many New Yorkers live and work at Penn State then and now, and a couple of them saying, after some of the initial shock dies down, people tend to go with dark comedy pretty fast. And I remember one fellow saying, well, all we did was hate that thing our entire lives. Some people will be, glad. And I thought, well, that's probably pushing it. But, if you go back and look at the press at the time, there were a certain snootiness about them, even after this global atrocity, occurs here on our soil. People, there was a severe dislike because, of course, it was we would have called it urban renewal in the 60s and 70s, but it displaced lots of folks. It displaced, many businesses. But there is a before and after effect on what happens to Lower Manhattan because of that. Lower Manhattan wasn't any different from Houston or Atlanta, right? These cities where you go into their urban corridors, you leave at 5 o'clock and that's it. It was where people went into work.
Mhm.
You know, some historians have argued that Lower Manhattan became a part of the city because of the World Trade Center. You know, people bought their groceries nearby. They shopped, you know, at the mall there or across the street at some of the clothiers. You know, so it had really become part of the fabric. And of course, one of the qualities I think we all admire in our city dwellers just to the north is the way in which, you know, they may have not always loved the World Trade Center, but when somebody comes and attacks it, you know, they close ranks. And obviously there was some really good work done in that way.
Because you referenced the attacks, and of course the towers are the site of not one but two terrorist attacks, right? There's the February 1993 truck bombing beneath the North Tower, and then of course September 11th. So them being targeted, is that, in your opinion, simply a matter of population density, or is it a purposeful kind of attack on the symbolism of the sites?
Oh, I think it was all about the symbolism, you know, saying this is the World Trade Center. I guess in some ways was raising a flag, right, about might and modernism and all of these sorts of things. So I think it was absolutely about that. And you know, what we learned in 1993 was that this was going to be relentless. And you know, it wasn't like it was 1993 and then 2001. There were other sorts of operations that were being, you know, put forth by terrorists. The 1993 one was obviously the physics of it, trying to knock one tower down into the other, was pretty cockeyed, but a lot of the other parts of their plan, you know, could have gone a certain way, and many, many, many more people could have died, as opposed to, I'm not sure about the exact number, 8 or 11 or whatever it was. One of them was one of the restaurant workers, Orlando Mercado, I believe is his last name. Maybe it's Orlando Mercado, and he was actually at the loading dock down in the basement checking on the new provisions when the truck bomb went off. And he actually fell into the gaping hole of, I guess, doom. Yeah. So I actually make sure he appears in the novella. Wilfredo. Yeah, that's his name.
On a lighter note, in the book, you talk about the Twin Towers in pop culture. You talk about people scaling the building and walking a tightrope walk between the buildings and then being in King Kong. Do you have a favorite Twin Towers in pop culture moment?
You know, it's probably the King Kong one. And I don't know that I would have included that, except one of my Penn State colleagues who had lived in Lower Manhattan at the time had read my novella, and he was having me speak at for his group. And I did my talk on the novella. And afterwards, he just regaled us with the wonderful story of after the film was done and this King Kong carcass was laying there and they were done shooting, and, you know, it's just a big prop, right? But it was laying there between the towers. And he said, the funny thing that happened was it sort of, for a little while, just became part of the city. You know, people are having their lunch sitting on King Kong, you know, or, I mean, today there'd be 1,000 of us, me too, taking cell phone photos of it, right? But, you know, it just for a little bit, it became part of the city. And of course, the point of his anecdote was just how quickly we can regularize or routinize things in life, right? Particularly in city life, where, okay, I guess that street's going to be closed off. Start putting out some tables, you know, get a business going. You know, things become regularized, and I really do like that anecdote. Probably the best of them.
Now, memories fade with time. I was just talking with my students about how, you know, the commemoration of Pearl Harbor Day used to be such a national event, right? And we currently do that for September 11th. For how long will we, you know? What I'd like to ask you as a scholar, you know, student of the World Trade Center, will the towers always hold a special place in American public memory, or do you fear that they too will fade with time?
Oh, no, I think they will. And like, like the Pearl Harbor Memorial, which is so moving with the glass bottom experience and the Arizona, I think the city has done a lot of or the powers that be have done a lot of the right things to create a living memorial. I hope we can transform it as time goes on into a kind of positive catalyst, for citizenry and those good things, and not just keep it in the space of mourning. And I'm by no means suggesting that we should not be mourning those folks. I mourned the restaurant workers in my own way by writing a novella. So, we do what we can, but if there's a way to transform it into something that becomes part of the fabric of us being better citizens, that could be pretty amazing. And I know there's some work being done. When you go into the museum, where I've been there several times, I've taken Mama students there on 2 occasions already, pre-COVID. But there are already things they're doing to try to spur on education about different peoples and religions, et cetera, et cetera. But if there's a way to create some kind of concrete push for better citizenry, I think that we need that now more than ever.
Yeah, that's something we really wanted to do with this project. We're commemorating the 147 individuals from Monmouth County that we lost, but we also want everyone to stop and think about the questions we all asked ourselves in the aftermath of 9/11, right? How do you balance freedom and national security? What does it mean to be a patriot or a good citizen, as you put it? Because there are so many lessons that we can learn that I think we do ourselves a disservice if we only remember those we've lost. Of course, we want to do that, but also have these more difficult conversations. So I appreciate that point. And that leads me to my next question. You said you've taken 2 groups of Monmouth students to the museum and memorial already. Why do you think that's important?
Well, for one thing, I think that as educators, we have a duty to try to provide as many kinds of opportunities to experience culture and museums and the like, whatever it happens to be, because I know I have vivid memories as a youth, in a where we had a single breadwinner and my mother was at home. And so we were able to make time for lots of things, plays, et cetera. And a lot of families simply don't have the bandwidth now. And I think we, as educators, whenever possible, should be building in experiential learning. In one case, I was fortunate to go along with our colleagues in the criminal justice department. And what a magnificent trip. Everything I knew was suddenly supplemented by a lot of really excellent law enforcement perspective about some of the things that happened that day. So I really do think we're duty bound, especially now as we come out of the pandemic, to get those sorts of things rolling again, because we might be surprised, even with a university where I worked before, Penn State, where, students were pretty good students, right? Pretty good caliber students. I remember when I was honors coordinator, to reference that moment earlier, I'd take them to see a play in Washington, D.C., and it's the first time they'd ever been to a play. And I'm thinking, what? And of course, a little research and found that they were hardly alone in that. And as you know, from being around here, there are still students in many of our institutions whom you talk to them and they've never been on a plane. Or they too have never been to a play, and you're thinking, Broadway, it's 27 miles from here. What's going on? But modern life is complicated, and we can't make those assumptions. So I look for ways to build in, and I know you do too, and others, to build in speakers into my classroom. I did law and literature last summer, and while we were still sort of COVID bound, I was able to get the AP justice reporter from LA to come in and speak to our class. Full disclosure, she's a Monmouth alum, so I knew how to reach her. But things like that really make a difference, I think, to students. And we shouldn't assume that they've been to the World Trade Center Museum, even though we live so very close to it.
Well, Ken, thank you so much for taking a little time out of your day to talk to us about the history and cultural significance of the World Trade Center. Is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't covered?
No, thank you for allowing me to be a part of it. And I'm sure there are thousands of stories like mine where someone is moved by what happened to create art or the like. In fact, I have toyed with the idea of doing a cultural history of the sphere. The wonderful public artwork that, of course, survives now. It's near the Greek Orthodox Church. It's since been moved from Battery Park. But, I think there's a lot of work to be done to try to understand the historical place of these objects and the people who work there.
And that was the only piece of art that survived, right? If I recall.
Just
correctly.
about, of all the major pieces. Yeah,
Yeah.
many of them, like the Cloud Fortress, which was, I'm happy to say I got to see once, in previous years, was lost. The place was filled with artwork, but there were 6 or 7, and I tried to document all of the major pieces in the World Trade Center book, but there were 6 or 7 world-class pieces. But the sphere, it's going to take more than that, right? So I'm glad it has a nice perch now, looking over the whole area.
All right, Ken. Well, thank you so much. I will look forward to seeing maybe that next book that comes out.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ken. Have a good day.